In today's video, we are zooming into Gukesh and we are going to be breaking down his top 5 favorite chess openings. Let's go. So we're going to begin by looking at his black repertoire. So with the black pieces against e4, this is where we're going to start. And I think this exploration is interesting. First of all, if you're just curious about what Gukesh plays, especially given the fact that he is very likely to become the next world champion, I think it's useful to understand what repertoire he has up his sleeve. But also, maybe if you want to try to play like Gukesh, emulate his style a little bit, then hopefully this video will give you the foundational openings that you can try to look into. Okay, so against e4, what does he play? Well, opening number 1 is the Sicilian. He plays this in many of his games, and let's go a little bit more deep, because in the Sicilian there are many variations, and it's interesting to note that he doesn't play into the most common Najdorf, which is the move d6 here, and following the exchange in the center, after knight f6, knight c3, the move a6. He does not play these Najdorf systems, which are very topical at the top level. Instead, he often opts for the move knight c6 here, which is the second most common move at the highest level. The point is that after d4 in the open Sicilians, what he wants to do is to play knight f6, knight c3, and now not play for these a6 systems, but play for the quick e5. These are known as the Sveshnikov Sicilian, and these are very sharp, very dynamic, and like I said, not as popular as the Najdorf Sicilians. Okay, so that was one opening he plays against e4, but before we move on to what he plays against d4, let's stick with e4 for one more opening, because Gukesh also plays the Caro-Kann, which is c6. He plays this quite a bit, and I think the Caro-Kann has a very boring and drawish reputation, especially, for example, in the exchange Caro-Kann, where due to the fact that the center seems a bit more closed, it doesn't seem like there's as much dynamic chances. And this is true, especially compared to the Sicilian, as we just saw. However, what is interesting to note is that there's a lot of strategic depth in these sort of positions. So I'll give you an example. Gukesh recently played the Caro-Kann in the Olympiad in the past month. And in the round 3 of the Olympiad, he found himself in this position with the black side. And I'll just show you how the game developed. Bishop d3 was played here, which is a very interesting idea. The point is to play against the bishop on c8. The bishop can't come to g4, and it also can't come to f5 now. And after knight c6 attacking the pawn, c3 defending the pawn, Gukesh played the move queen c7. And he's doing the same sort of thing. He's playing against the bishop on c1, not letting it develop actively to f4. So I'll stop the analysis here because this is an opening video, but I just want to show you that the Caro-Kann, although it seems very boring and very solid, and to some extent it might be, there's also a lot of strategic depth in terms of the different move orders you play, and Gukesh definitely has thought deeply about how he wants to maneuver his pieces in these closed structures. So that is another opening that he has up his sleeve against e4. Let's now move on to d4. So we're still with the black side, but now looking at what he does against the move 1d4. Now, he plays the move knight f6 here, and after c4, he has to make the key decision. Do you go into the King's Indian territory or the Grunfeld territory with the moves g6, or do you play e6? This is what he does. And e6 signals more of a Nimzo, Queen's Indian, maybe Rogozin. It's still not exactly clear how the game will progress, so let's clarify that a little bit. In this position against the move knight f3, for opening number 3, Gukesh plays the move d5. And this takes the game into Rogozin territory after knight c3, bishop to b4. This is known as the Rogozin opening. And in the Rogozin, as you can kind of tell, black is playing very principled chess. They're not messing around with any unnecessary pawn moves like b6, which you see in, for example, the Nimzo, and instead all that black is doing is they are striking in the center, taking control, and then developing their kingside pieces and castling quickly. And they're also developing their pieces in such a way that keeps control over the center and develops them very actively. So it's a very fundamental and principled-based opening, and I think for that reason, especially for beginners, this is a great opening that you can choose to play. This takes us to opening number 4, and in this position, this is a critical breaking point because there's the move knight f3, and now you had to make a decision, and like I said, Gukesh plays for d5 in the Rogozin, but he could have instead played, for example, the Queen's Indian with b6, and instead of knight f3, after knight c3, again you have to make some sort of decision. You can play the Nimzo Indian with the move bishop to b4, and maybe given the fact that he played bishop b4 in the Rogozin against knight f3, some of you might expect him to play the Nimzo, but While he does have a couple of games in the Nimzo, more often than not, he plays the immediate d5 here anyways. And this is more of just a queen's gambit declined variation with the insertion of the knight moves. This, by the way, as you can tell, can transpose after knight f3 to the Rogozin that we just saw. And otherwise, I think the main move is bishop to g5, and after bishop e7, the game progresses and you have sort of a normal game of chess after e3 castles, and knight to f3, and h6, and then b6. And the interesting thing about these structures is that black really prioritizes, like I said, quick development and castling, but they don't forget about the idea of advancing with b6, perhaps with c5, or otherwise just giving their bishop a couple of options for strong developing squares on the queen side. So again, a very slow but strategical opening. And finally, guys, we are talking about his opening with the white side for opening number 5. And he plays the ready, which is one knight f3. Now here's the thing. Knight f3 is extremely flexible, and so he doesn't only play one opening like some of the other players in this series that we've looked at. He instead has a plethora of different systems that he plays, and all of those systems involve an early knight moving to f3, hence he often starts with the move knight f3, known as the ready. So let's actually quickly take a look at some of those systems. For example, sometimes against d5, the most common, he plays the King's Indian attack with g3, and then he quickly develops the bishop to g2. And in these sort of systems, he often doesn't play d4, but rather plays d3 and e4. And so he's had this exact position in the past. But sometimes he doesn't actually play d3, and he does play for d4. So for example, after knight f3, d5, sometimes he plays d4 here. And after knight f6, he plays the London system, for example, with bishop f4. And he's had this exact position right here in the past. And I should note, he's not worried about bishop takes f4 because that would strengthen white's control over the dark squares. And similarly, instead of bishop f4 here, he sometimes plays c4. And now you get into more typical Queen's Gambit declined territory after the move e6. And in fact, now we have a transposition to the Rogozin. And so you can see that Gukesh is wildly flexible when it comes to his repertoire with the white side. He basically doesn't really touch the e-pawn. He doesn't play for an early e4 as often as some of the other players at his level. So he doesn't get into the Roy Lopez or the Italian as much, but very often he sticks to knight f3 systems that either involve d4 and c4 and an expansion on the queen side, or a quick fianchetto with g3, bishop g2, and then sometimes later striking with e4, or some sort of combination between the expansion on the queen side with a quick fianchetto. So very flexible, a lot of options, and his opponents don't really know what to prepare. Thank you for watching. Subscribe if you're new around here, like the video if you learned something from it, and I'll see you guys next time. Peace out.